What's up, guys? I'm Sci-Hi, and today I'm going to take a look at a return to the Esper Reanimator deck featuring a few new Neon Dynasty cards and as well as the Kaito Shizuki, which I've been pretty bullish on lately, been talking about, and I think I found a great home for him in this Esper Reanimator deck. But without further ado, we'll dive right into things. If you're not familiar with Esper Reanimator, of course, what we're looking to do is use reanimation effects like Unburial Rites, or Late to Dinner, or Priest of Fell Rites that can all put a creature from our graveyard directly into play. So naturally, what we want to do is put the most oppressive, big, large creature into play as possible. And I firmly believe in Historic right now, the best two creatures that you can possibly put into play are Serra's Emissary and Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. Talked about this in previous videos, but I'll talk about it again here, of course, because we are covering the Esper Reanimator deck. But Serra's Emissary is a 7/7 flyer with an incredibly unique ability in that as it enters the battlefield, we choose a card type, and you and all creatures you control have protection from the chosen card type. So in a vacuum, almost always you choose creature, and now you're immediately immune to all creature damage, creature effects, creatures that could target you. All of your creatures have protection from creatures. That means none of them can be blocked. And for many decks, at least especially in best of one or game ones, a lot of decks aren't even equipped to handle this, and it's just immediately you win the game if you name creature. It can certainly get more complicated. Against some decks, creature isn't what you want to name. For example, against other control decks, you have to assess the situation and try to read out what your opponent's deck is, but it can be correct in some instances to name Planeswalker to prevent maybe a Teferi from tucking the Serra's Emissary or targeting it. It can also be sometimes tricky to know when to name instant, but there are occasional times, again, this is all dependent on the present game state, but there are times when naming instant can be correct. Maybe you're up against like a Arclight Phoenix deck or something, and they don't have a lot of creature presence, but you worry they may have 2 burn spells, which can be enough to finish off Serra's Emissary if they're doing 6 damage a pop. So it can be tricky to know what to name. When in doubt, I always just say, just name creature and hope for the best. Most of the time, you're going to get a concession out of that. But so bringing this card into play extremely fast is totally broken and can win the game on the spot. However, Serra's Emissary against control decks isn't necessarily the best creature because there's nothing you can do to wriggle your way out of a Wrath of God. You can't, even if you name protection from sorceries, it doesn't work like that. The Wrath of God doesn't, of course, target the Serra's Emissary. It's a blanket sweep, so you are going to lose it. So against control, Serra's Emissary isn't necessarily the best card. However, I will argue that Ulamog then is the best creature you want to put into play. Ulamog, again, another pet card of mine. Just an incredible creature and an incredibly unique creature. 10/10 indestructible. When you cast a spell, you exile 2 target permanents. Sadly, we won't be getting that trigger most often in this deck because we aren't casting him unless the game has spiraled out into some crazy land and we actually got 10 mana to cast it. But most of the time, we're not getting that trigger. But what we are going to get is a trigger on whenever Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger attacks, defending player exiles the top 20 cards of their library. Now that can be huge against decks where maybe you're up against the mirror match and they've landed a Serra's Emissary and they've named creature, and now you can't kill them with damage. So that's okay because you've got Ulamog. You can use Ulamog to deck them. It's not going to take long to exile their entire library when you're exiling 20 cards a pop with each attack from this thing. Also, against like non-mirror match, maybe you're up against a deck that has just gained an extraordinary amount of life or even pseudo-infinite life on Magic Arena. That's all fine because you just kill them or mill them, as the old saying goes. If you can't kill them with their life, just mill them out of the game. Again, this is going to have great application against Enchantress decks, where they try to get the 9 live Solemnity combo on you. Suddenly damage doesn't matter. We don't have any way to make the opponent lose life in instances like that. But again, we can deck them with Ulamog. So between Ulamog and Serra's Emissary, these are your primary targets to reanimate and just kill the opponent. And we also have 2 other additions, and one of them's pretty spicy and a new one from Neon Dynasty. We'll get to that in a second, but first let's just cover the other old kind of stock creature that I would run in an Esper Reanimator deck, and that is Sheoldred, the Whispering One. This thing's pretty nuts. 6/6 Swamp Walk. At the beginning of your upkeep, you return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, which is awesome in this deck, obviously, because we're trying to litter the graveyard with huge monstrous creatures, and now we can reanimate them not only with our spells, but we can use Sheoldred to reanimate them on a turn-by-turn basis. As well as that, it also has, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player sacrifices a creature. So you have a functional Abyss, the old school bomb card from Legends, I believe, where your opponent is required to sacrifice one of their creatures every turn. This is another card that is backbreaking against aggro decks if landed early. It can have application against control as well, just to keep reanimating your threats. As well as, in the mirror match, it is awesome because it can be very difficult to deal with an opposing Ulamog, but forcing your opponent to sacrifice it, that's one clean way to deal with an indestructible creature. So Sheoldred is good enough, in my book, to warrant 1 copy in this Esper Reanimator list. Now we can get to the last remaining creature, and it's a spicy, interesting card for sure, in Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant. So this one is a 7 mana 5/5. You may remember a lot of lists, Reanimator lists, would run the other Jin-Gitaxias, which I believe would draw you 7 cards, and at your opponent's end step, it would make their maximum hand size equal to 0. So they would effectively have to discard their whole hand. Very good, powerful card for sure, but it's one that I have personally shied away from and not run in these Reanimator lists because I just feel that these other cards play a more important role. Kind of like I described how important Ulamog and Serra's Emissary can be in just winning the game outright. Whereas like Ulamog's difficult for control to deal with, and it has the very important ability of milling your opponent when you can't kill them with conventional damage. So like I was saying, I've never really run the old Jin-Gitaxias. I haven't found it powerful enough. To me, it's kind of like a win more card where you're drawing 7 cards, and yeah, you get to potentially make your opponent discard their whole hand, but you have to wait a whole turn to do that, and it just has not really felt as powerful as these other cards that you can run that I've described already, like the Sheoldred, Ulamog, and Serra's Emissary. They just strictly more powerful in what you're trying to do, win the game ultimately. However, with this new Jin-Gitaxias, I actually believe 1 spot for this new hot card is warranted. So what does this do? It's 5/5, and whenever you cast an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell, copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for the copy. This ability triggers only once each turn, unfortunately. Now, that ability isn't fantastic. It's certainly useful in this deck to copy our spells. We can get multiple Faithful Mending copies going, Otherworldly Gazes. The best thing we could actually copy in this deck would just be another Reanimation spell to potentially reanimate 2 creatures. But hopefully we're not having to do that. Again, it's a very win-more scenario. But what we're really excited about to run this card is the second, would say paragraph. There's so much text on these cards now. I guess it's not quite a paragraph, but the second sentence on this card is what excites me the most. And it reads, whenever an opponent casts an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell, counter that spell. This ability triggers only once each turn. Now that is pretty exciting. Now we have a soft lock once this guy is out. This is useful against a wide variety of decks. This is useful against control. Now they have to try to find 2 sources of removal because their first card's always going to get countered. This is good against other aggro decks. Burn decks, we're just going to counter their first burn spell every time. So this card is good enough that it can achieve at least a soft lock, and 5/5 is not too bad either. But don't get me wrong, I still don't think this card is not as strong, of course, as I've already described, as the Serra's Emissary or the Ulamog. If we could, I would just be running 5 Ulamogs and 5 Serra's Emissaries, honestly, because they're just so decisive, victory-based cards, and they're just so important. But I've configured this deck to run a total of 10 powerful creatures and 10 Reanimator effects. So we've got a perfect balance there, and the rest of the deck is configured to enable the Reanimation effect in finding the right cards and getting them in our graveyard. So we just looked at all the 10 powerful creatures that we can reanimate. Now we can look at the 10 ways to reanimate them. Of course, they're the Unburial Rites, 4 copies, the Priest of Fell Rites, 4 copies, and then we sneak in just a couple late to dinners in there for just another Unburial Rites effect. So we have 10 total ways to get these 10 creatures back. So we're going to find these things, especially when we have these other enabling cards, which we can look at right now. So at the 1-drop, we've got Stitcher's Supplier, which again, just an all-star for graveyard-based decks. 1 black, 1/1. When it enters the battlefield or dies, mill 3 cards. So this thing can put a total of 6 cards into our graveyard. And of course, we want this thing to be milling and finding Unburial Rites because we can flash it back. Or even Priest of Fell Rites is fine because it has basically flashback effect as well in Unearth. This guy, she can be unearthed and then just use the effect to reanimate a big creature that way. So that's all good. We want to find, obviously with Stitcher Supplier, we want to find these reanimation effects that can be played from the graveyard, or most importantly, of course, we want to spill over our creatures, put those in the graveyard so we can reanimate them as fast as possible. And also to help with this process, we've got 4 Otherworldly Gaze, which was a relatively new addition to these Reanimator decks, and didn't see play at first. At first glance or gaze, I guess pun intended, of Otherworldly Gaze, you're losing card value or card advantage rather. You're not drawing cards, but the card selection of this, it almost feels like like a shitty Brainstorm. Obviously, it's not as good as Brainstorm, but in this deck, it has a similar feel because for 1 blue and at instant speed to boot, we're looking at the top 3 cards of our library. Put any number of them into your graveyard and the rest back on top of your library in any order, and it flashbacks to do the whole thing again. So it's very similar to Stitcher's Supplier, and then it can put up to 6 things in the graveyard. So it's going to find stuff. It's going to find the material that you need to put in the graveyard. But obviously different in that you don't have much control over what's going into the graveyard with Stitcher's Supplier, whereas with Otherworldly Gaze, we get the power of blue, and this is incredible card selection. So this is a really consistent deck with these 2 cards. Otherworldly Gaze, even if we're not using it to find something to put in the graveyard, obviously this can't put things or discard things that are already in our hand, but we have other ways to do that as we'll get to. But just the ability to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and essentially surveil all of them is huge. We can ensure that we hit that 4th land drop to cast Unburial Rites, or we ensure we find the right creature that we want to target to reanimate. This is just a huge card, and I view kind of a staple in this archetype right now. And it feels so good to have 2 really powerful 1-drops so we can curve really well with this deck. So we talked and covered at length these 2 1-drops. Now let's move into the 2-drop space. Of course, we already talked about Priest of Fell Rites. I'm surprised I don't see some lists not running 4 copies of this. Yeah, the 3 life hurts to reanimate something, but it really doesn't matter if what you're reanimating just wins the game on the spot. Again, if it's a Serra's Emissary or Ulamog, as early as turn 3, that can just be lights out for a lot of decks. They just can't deal with that. So ideally, you know, what you're doing on turn 1, you have one of these spells and you find a creature immediately. Turn 2, with a powerful creature already in your graveyard, you're casting Priest of Fell Rites, and on the 3rd turn, even if you haven't found something in your graveyard on the 3rd turn, or by the 3rd turn start, you're going to untap this guy. It's not going to have Summoning Sickness, and you can use these cards again, find something. So it is very likely that if you have Priest of Fell Rites, assuming you're up against Goldfish and your opponent doesn't have interaction, you're going to do your thing sooner or later. You're going to put a really powerful creature into play. It's just that consistent. And to, again, further this process, also in the 2-drop spot, we've got 4 Faithful Mendings, another powerful new card that has been released relatively recently. It's like the Faithless Looting, but for Azorius, of course. Faithful Mending, gaining 2 life, which is nice to kind of offset that paying 3 life from the Priest, as well as a lot of shock lands in this deck, admittedly, because we want to hit have the exact perfect mana that we need, because time is of the essence, and we're looking to do broken things as quickly as possible. So we got a lot of shock lands. So the gaining 2 life is relevant and nice, but of course, the main reason we're using this is just to further out the process of getting things in our graveyard and reanimating them. So we've got 4 Faithful Mendings, gain 2 life, draw 2 cards, and discard 2 cards. So this is good and important in that discarding cards is an important difference in that these cards can't rid your powerful creatures if they're already in your hand. You need to use something like Faithful Mending. Also has Flashback, which is very relevant for more life and more card selection. So very good staple card of the archetype for sure. Now moving on to a card I'm most excited about, Kaito Shizuki. This card to me feels like just a natural fit in this deck. I've talked about this in previous videos a little bit, but a 3-mana Planeswalker that can draw you cards is pretty powerful. There's not a lot of 3-mana Planeswalkers that just start drawing you cards. Now, obviously, this guy's ability is +1 draw a card, then discard a card unless you attack this turn. Now, most of the time, that's supposed to be a disadvantage. Obviously, in this deck, we want to be discarding things, and this facilitates that perfectly. It digs deeper, finds cards that we need, finds these creatures, lets us discard them and get them into the graveyard. But additionally, it also has an ability that is extremely interesting. This -2 ability. Create a 1/1 blue ninja creature token with this creature can't be blocked. Now, when you have unblockable ninja tokens that are attacking, then obviously its first ability can become just a draw effect, and you don't even have to discard if you're not looking to discard anymore. But the ability to commit a permanent effect onto the battlefield in a Planeswalker that can facilitate Reanimator's primary function is extremely powerful. You know, there's a lot of cards. There's other cards we could use. There's another new card printed in whatever this werewolf set is called. I'm just horrible with names. I forget the names of sets immediately after they're released. But there's a card that for 2 blue and 1 colorless that can counter a spell or draw 2, discard 2 at instant speed, which is a card, if you've watched my previous Reanimator video from way back when this channel was just getting off the ground, that was a card that I had deemed really powerful, and I still think that card is powerful, but I've really started to gravitate towards this new hotness in this Planeswalker that I think has been, not enough people, in my opinion, have been talking about this card. I think it's more powerful than people may realize. Admittedly, of course, some of these abilities of this thing are pretty janky, but allow me to further sell you on this card. We already talked about its +1 ability that is repeated turn after turn. Absolutely relevant in a Reanimator deck. This is now a difficult thing for your opponent to deal with in that it's a Planeswalker. Not to mention, it has that interesting ability of phasing out the turn you play it, so your opponent can't kill it on their next turn. They can't attack with it. They can't even target it until it phases back in. So you're almost always going to get at least 2 activations with this. But the extra abilities are totally relevant in this deck. Sometimes when in a grindier game, these ninja tokens actually become very relevant. Obviously they're not going to kill your opponent extremely fast, but we got to talk about the ultimate. Now, this ultimate is really weird, and admittedly, it does require kind of building around it. And we're not like all in on the ultimate or anything in this deck, but it is important that in some decks that might run Kaito Shizuki, the ultimate is just kind of bunk. It's not going to do anything if your deck's not really built to actually take advantage of it or do anything cool. But this deck can actually use it, at least kind of incidentally, in that, say we've got creatures, maybe ninja tokens, other creatures in play, Stitcher suppliers even, which I didn't even mention. You do have these early 1-drops that can attack, and if you don't need to discard a card, you already have what you need in your graveyard. This just becomes a powerful draw card for +1 on a 3-mana planeswalker. I mean, that is sick. It's just a really obscene power as a repeatable effect in a planeswalker form. But again, we talked most of the time in this deck, you want to discard a card. So the +1 ability is just absolutely bomb in a Reanimator deck. This card just fits nicely here. But again, moving on to the ultimate ability, this is extremely fun. Okay, so what is it? You get an emblem with whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a blue or black creature card, put it on the battlefield, then shuffle. So it just so turns out that we have a couple bomb-ass black and blue creatures in Sheoldred and Jin-Gitaxias. So while it's not necessarily the easiest thing to ultimate with this guy, in grindier games, you're going to find that as early as this thing comes down, and while your opponent is dealing, if maybe they have a very interactive deck, and they're counterspelling your reanimation effects, or they've got cards where they're removing them from the graveyard, maybe they've got a Scavenging Ooze, or just something stupid. They're disrupting you in ways that is preventing you from landing your monstrous creature. Well, this guy is just going to continue to tick up and be difficult to get off the battlefield for some decks. And as it approaches that 7 loyalty, that is a strong enough effect, at least in this deck, that people have to respect that, and they have to now devote resources and kind of be pressured to kind of deal with this guy. And that's just a whole nother dimension to Reanimator that we didn't have before. A lot of times we're just using some stupid card to just draw 2 cards and discard them, and that's the end of it. Well, this is doing that repeatedly, turn after turn, and deterministically approaching that -7 ultimate ability. And once you have that emblem, it's not that difficult to deal combat damage to your opponent with a creature. Either it's just one of these knuckleheads getting in there, or hopefully it's an unblockable ninja token, which Kaito already sets you up with, and you hit your opponent with one of those. Now you get to search up something that's not in your graveyard, so it's avoiding graveyard hate. Now you get to immediately just go slam a bomb like Jin-Gitaxias or maybe a Sheoldred, depending on what the game state is. You can make a choice of which one's better. But of course it is a blue or black creature, so we can't go get these other guys, but we certainly can get Jin-Gitaxias or Sheoldred and then get that soft lock on them that I was talking about. So really excited for this guy. I've been playing a lot of ranked games with it so far, and he's just done disgusting things. But moreover, I'm talking from a purely competitive standpoint. This makes a lot of sense, but it is also just extremely fun. It is so fun, like playing this deck. It already was really fun, just slamming powerful creatures and humiliating your opponent early and winning with such decisive, clean, quick victories. But now you've got this second dimension in Kaito where you can kind of get this backdoor way of ultimating and getting these creatures into play a fun and interesting way that your opponent just isn't expecting. And most people, when they see this, like, they don't know what the hell you're trying to do. But some of the times, you're not even trying to go for that. It just kind of happens naturally because they're dealing with so much other stress and pressure from these big creatures that they kind of lose track of this guy, and his loyalty just keeps creeping up. And then it's like, oh shit, he's gonna alt. What does that mean? Your opponent doesn't know what's going on, but they know you're a Reanimator deck at that point, so they're like, oh gosh, I better respect this guy. They've probably got a lot of just nasty, horrible creatures that you could put into play, and you could certainly build this with more blue and black creatures, and if that's what you're going for, to try to like actually plan to alt. But in this deck, I'm just strictly looking at it as like a backdoor incidental thing that can happen sometimes. I mean, if it does, that's awesome. Way to go, Kaito. But a lot of times, if nothing else, this is just a repeatable engine to continue drawing and discarding cards, or just drawing cards, depending on what we have in play, to further promote your game plan, your primary game plan of just rocking these big guys into play. So this is absolutely a very competitive deck. I fully endorse this. I've gotten to Mythic with this Esper Reanimator as well in the past. Super powerful, especially in best of one. We can just absolutely shit on a lot of decks that just aren't prepared to deal with these creatures. You've got game against everything in the format. Like I said, you've got game even against control, because a lot of decks, if they don't have the right form of removal at the right time, Ulamog will just kill them fast and mill them fast. But then again, against aggro, Serra's Emissary is your best bet. It's just going to absolutely wreck a lot of aggro decks. Name creature, they can't deal with it. But again, also against control, the Jin-Gitaxias is really strong as well in kind of getting that soft lock I was talking about, and making it a lot more difficult for them to disrupt what you're trying to do. Again, against control, you ultimately want to get Ulamog into play, but sometimes you'll get this guy into play first, and he can kind of lay down the cover fire with this counter blanket effect, in that you can actually then resolve these reanimation effects without a damn counter spell disrupting what you're trying to do. So it's an extremely fun deck. Let me know in the comments, guys, what you think of it. What do you think of Kaito? I think he makes a ton of sense here. I've already had enough success with him in ranked games that I'm put him in this list, and I totally endorse it. Didn't talk about the lands, but there's nothing special going on. It is literally just a smattering again of the best Esper lands. A lot of shock lands. It's not the end of the world, because we do have some gain life effects to offset that. And again, we're generally okay to take a few shocks to get the right lands in early, so that we can start generating these powerful effects. And this deck is extremely consistent between all the milling and drawing and the Otherworldly Gazes. Like, almost every game, you're going to land one of these powerful effects. And at that point, it's like, what does your opponent have? Can you trump this? And a lot of times they can't. So, powerful deck for sure. Let me know what you guys think of it in the comments. I'll have the deck list there. Probably continue grinding this deck. Get back at it. Get back into Mythic. And do some gameplay videos. But I'll leave it at that. Appreciate you guys watching till the end. Let me know what you think of it. And as always, if you're playing the ladder, good luck on it. I'm Sci High. Peace.